If you just let the grey elephant sit there in the room, the danger is that you wake up one morning and you're reading a stampede of grey elephants about your business in the newspapers or through a litigation. For example, actions in courts are beginning to be brought around both connections to forced labour and modern slavery itself, and misleading and deceptive conduct type claims, because businesses are saying they're ethical, but actually they're connected to these kinds of practices. So leadership in this space is really about wrapping your arms around that risk as it relates to your business. And that means a couple of things. First of all, it means you need to do.
Welcome to the Elephants in the Boardroom podcast. Lovely to have you along again this month. My name is Graeme Codrington.
And I'm Dean van Leeuwen, joined for you from south of London.
And I'm based in Johannesburg. And today we're going to timestamp this recording because, my word, at the beginning of March 2026, the world is as fast a moving place as it's been in a while, especially in the Middle East. We're thinking of friends, colleagues, and family who are impacted by, well, I suppose there's lots of situations around the world, but especially in and around the Middle East at the moment. And in fact, Dean, that's sort of where I wanted to start. You know, we're not journalists and news analyzers, so we're not going to try and give our insights yet into what's happening in the Middle East and America and Israel and Iran and other nations and their responses. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of heat at the moment, and I'm not sure that we can add much to it. And I think most of our clients, their risk radars are running 100% at the moment. But what I noticed, just as a way of talking about the war, but from a very different angle, and I genuinely think this is something that is bigger than we think, which makes it a perfect topic for the Grey Elephant podcast. And it's called Polymarkets, or that is at least one of the brand names. It is a betting website. It's a betting group. I think Polymarkets is based out of France, actually. But you can bet on anything. Now we understand betting, sports betting, whatever, casino betting. But this is betting on world events. You can go onto these websites and you can put a bet on somebody doing something, a company making an announcement. And there were a number of people who created accounts a week or so ago. These were brand new accounts. They bet significant amounts of money that America, the USA, would bomb Iran before the 1st of March. Obviously, that's what happened in reality. And these accounts, within a space of about 36 hours, made $1.5 million profit, took the money out of the account, closed the account. Now, I don't know about you, Dean, but my ex-auditor can smell an insider trade from a mile away, but I don't think I need professional training to read. Somebody knew something, right? That can't be above board. What do you think of this betting markets, Dean, and the Polymarket thing? I mean, it's honestly intriguing me, and I'm not sure what I think about it.
I think you're right, Graeme. It's really intriguing, and I'm going to put a grey elephant lens over this. And for me, what it says is this is a new way of thinking. It's a new way of doing things. So that falls right in the middle of our grey elephant structural societal fractures. The rules for success and failure, how we do things, is shifting, it's transforming, it's changing dramatically. So the idea of having a platform, Polymarket, where you can bet on the outcome of future events, like is the US going to bomb Iran? Yeah, it's just an indication of the crazy world we live in. And just how much, an indication, I think, of just how much things have changed. Yeah, your point on whether or not there was some insider trading, I don't know. I think this was probably one of the worst kept secrets, of a country that's going to attack another one. I mean, everyone knew towards the end of was last week that embassies were moving staff out. People were saying, if you can get a plane ticket out of the UAE, fly. Doesn't matter where, just get out. It was obvious that this was coming. So insider trading, I don't know, possibly. But I don't think it took a lot of predicting to figure out that was a highly probable, high impact, not really ignored anymore outcome.
Yeah, impossible to ignore now, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, we've been talking about World War III, or these kind of levels, increasingly levels of conflict around the world for a number of years now. This has been on our radar. Yeah, we're not predicting that World War III is going to happen, but we're certainly saying there's an increased amount of this type of conflict. And if you take this further, you think about what our research has shown, that this is a once in a century transformation. These big shifts, these big transformations tend to be associated with conflict and with war. Now, will we have a massive world war scale conflict on the level of World War II, World War I? Possibly not. I mean, the probability is there, but I think war has changed. I think the war is fought in different ways, and we're definitely seeing new technology and drones and all of those things. So, yeah, I mean, let's hope that probability doesn't come to the fore, and that we can move on from this really awful conflict. But yeah, these are high up on people's risk radar at the moment, and yeah, we have to see what happens there.
Just in case people are saying, hey, come on, guys, get off the fence, do a little bit of predicting. Of course, if you frequent listeners, we don't predict the future, nobody can, but you can understand, and this is the grey elephant radar we talk about, these various big forces help us to make sense when structural change happens. And for me, Dean, the lens I would put on this is the multipolarity lens. Actually, at the moment, this is not the big forces versus the big forces. I've been very interested in how quiet Russia, India, China have been at the moment. And what you've got is America linked with Israel, obviously, and it's mainly, I think, being driven by Israel's agenda. I don't think that's controversial to say, on the one side. On the other side, you've got Iran, and America's goal has been to try and take out the leadership, and they seem to have been reasonably successful. What they don't seem to have realized is that Iran has decentralized their leadership. So there's a learning there. It doesn't work anymore. You can't assassinate the head of state and the country falls apart. It isn't falling apart. Then what Iran has done is it's pushed back not against the surrounding nations, it's pushed back against American bases with absolute precision. Yes, a few missiles have gone off in the wrong direction, bit of shrapnel here and there. But largely they've been focusing on American facilities. Now, you've got to think about the planning that was involved, the level of data analytics that was involved in the background. Iran is not using high-tech weapons, it's using data and analytics to do its thing. Now, I'm not trying to be a war analyst, I'm just pointing out that at the moment, the most likely scenario is that all of those local countries, the UAEs, the GCCs, so that's Saudi, Kuwait, Oman, and the Emirates, the very, very, very last thing that any of these guys want is instability, lack of flow of trade, shutting down all those beautiful hub airports. Whatever the public pronouncements are, they must be working day and night in the background to say, hey guys, how do we sort this out? This isn't a global war. This isn't big powers fighting each other. This is asymmetric things. There's going to be no winners or losers here. So the people who are most affected, the crown princes of all those Emirates and GCC countries, I think that's where I'm putting my hope and seeing what they were seeing. And as we record, it was just yesterday, the crown prince of Dubai and the prime minister and his daughter walking the streets and having their iftar meal in a local park, going to a coffee shop in the Dubai Mall. For me, an incredible sign of visible leadership in a country. You don't put out a press statement. It's a very different style in the Middle East. What do? You just go to say people, no, it's safe to go out. You can go and have coffee, go and shop. We're fine. We're going to open the airports as soon as we can. And it's just that quiet That's what gives me hope at the moment, Dean, is if the crown princes were freaking out, I'd be more worried. I think we're going to see a resolution reasonably soon. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been chaos, and we must prepare for that chaos. But I still think there's a better outcome than a worse one within a few days. So if that's a prediction, you can have it. But otherwise, it's maybe just a hope and a prayer for where things happen. But Dean, you, before even the conflict started, when we were talking about this episode, you had an interesting thought, which I think really links up nicely around where Europe is in all of this and what Europe's future might be. But over to you. What are you seeing? What's on your radar this month?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. And, we all know that Europe is a big player on the global stage. But in many ways, I think it's been a kind of sleeping giant and increasingly been seen as becoming more and more irrelevant. But there seems to be a strategic awakening of Europe's role in the global economy. And it's shifting from being mainly a market and a rule setter to actually becoming a builder of capability. They're starting to pass legislation and rules and incentives, which are already starting to decide where industries scale, which dependencies are cut, and which partners I think are backed. So a few things that have been pinging on our grey elephant radar, is the introduction of critical raw material rules to cut over dependence and build a domestic, supply and processing capabilities. They're also accelerating strategic capacity investments from defense to resilience programs around energy and supply chains. And this is all starting. There's definitely a rumble to say that, maybe, there's talk about sort of make Europe great again. And this is kind of a label that is echoing the American MAGA, but actually, it's more of I think there's a strategic awakening rather than a populist or a right wing movement to make Europe great again. There's structural, there's deep thinking that's happening to say, what are our competitive advantages? What is the role we play in the future? And I think what a lot of if you look at the multipolarity, you spoke about this earlier, Graeme, the multiple power blocks that are emerging in the world, I think Europe is there's a high potential that Europe is going to start playing a much stronger and more dominant role in this process. So, yeah. So if you're if you're a CEO or if you're a supply chain leader, this is now becoming increasingly strategic. It's not background Europe. It's not Europe of the old. I think we could be looking at Europe of the new. You need to be thinking about these competing, competitive blocks, economic blocks. You need to be thinking about the cost of being part of an industrial and security policy across multiple different power blocks. We need to be thinking about Europe's direction and how this will shape where critical minerals and metals are sourced, critical components. What's the trusted supply chain, and what does that mean for you? So these are just a few of the questions I think boards, CEOs, supply chain leaders need to be thinking about.
I'm fascinated to watch a particular aspect of this, Dean, and that is a few of the governments. I think I have it correct that it was Belgium, Germany, and France have all announced that they are no longer going to be using American software. Now,
Mm.
that's not a small announcement. One of the reasons was that I forget the exact details of the case, but one of the governments and one of the diplomats, was pushing back against America, and America then asked Google to switch off his Gmail account and asked Microsoft to give them access to his inbox, which then the technology companies did. And Europe just said, what? We can't have that happening. So again, there's these multiple layers from our grey elephant radar. The one is multipolarity. Dean, you and I would much prefer the world to be more globalized and interconnected and flat, to use Thomas Friedman's label. It isn't going that way. It's the multipolarity is the reality. It doesn't matter what we like or want. We're becoming these regional blocks of power, and Europe is one of them. I think mega rolls off the tongue better than mega, so I like that acronym. But this is a great opportunity for a company that might be able to create a Word or an Excel or a browser that's good enough for a government to use in Europe. And suddenly you've got a brand new tech titan company that emerges because they've got a ready-made market with European governments and citizens. And so for me, it's a wonderful example of just keeping your eyes open for these big, deep structural changes and realizing there's a moment of opportunity. Literally, it's the next 6 to 9 months. We might see a massive new software giant emerge. Who's it going to be? Nobody knows at this stage. So, lovely example for people to keep their eyes open.
So, Graeme, what are you seeing on your radar? I've got one other, but want to hand over to you. What's pinging on your radar?
In addition to obviously everything else that we are looking at the moment, I've been following some issues around the raw materials and the resources that are needed for technology. So this is even before you've got chips and processors. I'm talking silicon, I'm talking sand, I'm talking water. And again, these sound like boring things for professional futurists or professional people to be thinking about. But the weird thing is the world is running out of sand. We're running out of the type of sand we need to make the glass for the screens on our devices, the sand we use for silica and silicon in our chips. And that's why Taiwan, which has a particular geographic location, is not just a random island that people are nervous about. It's because of this location in the development of the actual hardware that we need for the technology revolution. So yeah, just interesting. We are running out of water and we're running out of sand. And that's not something I thought I'd need to worry about, but apparently I do.
So, Graeme, that's a great one. And let me pick up on that because my next, what's really pinging on my radar, and it has for a while, it's been a kind of a weak signal, but it's getting louder and louder, largely because it is being significantly ignored. And it's aging infrastructure. Leaders are, I think, fixated on shiny new assets. We hear a lot about data centers, hydrogen hubs, smart grids, AI, and all these things. But the aging backbone of our economies is quietly turning into a ticking time bomb. Bridges, substations, you mentioned water, sewer networks, rail, ports. These were built decades ago and are now carrying far higher loads under harsher weather and conditions and cyber risk and than I guess they were ever designed for. But on the flip side of this, there are huge business opportunities to invest in new infrastructure. It's not as sexy, but that's great because it means there's going to be fewer competitors playing in that space. Lovely opportunities for companies to really capitalize on the growing need, because this is going to become an area which we won't be able to ignore for much longer. We're using 20th century infrastructure to run a 21st century world. It's not going to happen. It's probably one of the reasons why Elon Musk is talking about putting data centers in space, is he knows the current infrastructure on Earth cannot handle it.
Good point. Nice one. Again, another really great example of what we talk about here on the podcast. Things that when you think about it, it's obvious and we know that they are. But what are you doing about it? Where is the opportunity? And how might it change the rules of the game in your industry? Great examples. Thanks, Dean. We have something different today, Dean. Dean and I have a colleague who we don't often see because our team is very virtual. Her name is Jude Fulston, but she happens to be in town today. And she's visiting and she's in the office. So I'm going to invite her to join us and have a quick chat. There we go, the magic of a cut edit. Jude is now in the office with me. We don't often get to be in the same physical location on our team. We're a very virtual team. And Jude Fulston, our digital director and person behind the scenes when it comes to dealing with issues of the future of education and so on. But Jude, we wanted to pick up a quick question with you because the other thing that Jude does for our team is look after the work that we do with some social investment projects. And this is something that we believe actually every business should be thinking about, flowing from looking at the world around you and all the things we can and can't do. One thing we can do is do good in the world. Hopefully, the business we do adds value to the world, but we can also do good through our people and through some of our projects. And at Tomorrow Today, we part of the 1% for the Planet grouping, and we just thought we've just done our sort of year-end look at some of the projects. And Jude, I know you're really excited about a project, an educational project. So tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so the latest project that we are working with, it's through the Kariga Foundation, who's a 1% member, and they're doing fantastic work in the community. And what I love about that is that they've realized that any system has to have all of the shareholders working alongside them. So they do ecotourism to provide jobs, they do education, they do food, they do entrepreneurship. It's all part of the system. And the project that we are supporting is Zanele from the Mbewu afternoon class and creche. And Zanele is just one of those women who, she was a teacher, training to be a teacher at the school that my two kids were. It's a very small learning hub in the Eastern Cape. And when I met Zanele, she was just so full of passion and joy for learning and for the kids. She just loved them. So she didn't necessarily have all the skills or the training yet, but in my opinion, she was just by far the most amazing teacher. And I knew back then already that I had to do something to support her. She loved my kids, I loved her, and I could just see what she was doing in her community. And when I say what she was doing, it's not like you or me, Graeme. I saw her with 3 roles that she had in her kitchen, and that was what she had. And she would be sharing those roles with the 8 kids that would come to her afternoon class. She teaches them how to read. So she has grade 4, grade 5, grade 6 learners come to her in the afternoon because they cannot read English. And she takes them right back to the foundations, I suppose, and phonetically. And she's found these courses that she has signed up for, and somehow she just keeps learning. She is a real lifelong learner, and this joy of learning comes down to the kids. She creates this safe area or space for learning. She's taken herself, the Kariga Foundation actually offers a program for social emotional learning. So she's got that qualification and she uses it every single day with these kids. So I just think it's amazing that we can support her. It's amazing that the work that she's doing will have an impact on these children to better their lives. And the last thing that I'm going to say is one of the realizations that I've had through the work of doing business for good is it's got to be personal for the donors. We've donated to a variety of charities, and for me, it always comes back to what are members in our team passionate about? Where do we want to see the work being done? And that is how you do business for good. It's not about the marketing or the blog post that you can get. It's about making a real difference, because that's where the real stories come from. So yeah, that's a little bit of a story about Sanele. She's doing amazing work, and she's got the support system. She's got a mentor who helps her every 2 weeks with budgets, with planning, with all sorts, and then the Kariga Foundation who then, give her additional support and the structure. So yeah.
And we are thrilled as a team to be supporting in the background. And the reason I wanted to bring this story in maybe this month is because when you think about everything that's happening in the world around us, and it's completely out of our control, there's nothing we can do. We just wait and see how things play out. We need to realize that part of being a force for good in the world is to do something that's local, that's personal, where you can make a difference. And we, as the Tomorrow Today team, have been really thrilled to be able to do that. So for me, this is almost the antidote to my nervousness about what's happening in the world, is to say, but we can make a difference here. And we have done that. And so, yeah, have a look at 1% for the Planet, started by Patagonia, and an organization that just helps companies to be a little bit more accountable and deliberate in the way that they do this work.
Yeah, Graeme, I think if I can add to that, a big part of thinking about the grey elephants and thinking about how you approach the future. And as we often say, we're strong believers that the best way to predict the future is to create it. And 1% for the planet is kind of it's a structural commitment to put aside 1% of our sales revenue towards causes that make a difference. Thinking about business as a force for good, it's an important strategic response to how these forces of progress, these grey elephants, are playing out in the world. And an important component of being a force for good is to link it to your core strategy. This is not CSR. This is not corporate social responsibility. It's about thinking about what's fundamental to your business and the future success. And for Tomorrow Today, we like to think of ourselves as thought leaders. We love to look at the trends and what's happening and, put the dots together, connect the dots and help people think about what they need to do to create a better working world. And for us, what Zanilo is doing is about educating the future leaders of our world. And that's why we see this as absolutely core to our business and why it's so important that we support it. So, we're thrilled to be partners with 1% for the planet and to really see that money that we put aside going to really causes that make a real difference in the world. Because that's just one of the small ways in that we can help to create this better working world. But Jude, fantastic having that you could join us today. By the way, I love the glasses. I haven't seen you wearing those glasses before. They're really, really great.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll be back after the break. We have a special guest, James Cockayne, who is the New South Wales Commissioner for Anti-Slavery, Modern Day Anti-Slavery Commission. It's going to be promised to be a fantastic conversation. Join us.
Elephants in the Boardroom is proudly brought to you by our partners at Achilles. As a leader in sustainable global risk management for businesses and their supply chains, Achilles helps the world's largest companies build and maintain ethical, sustainable and transparent business practices. While we explore the elephants in the boardroom, Achilles is at the forefront, guiding businesses through the risks and opportunities that these grey elephants present. If you're interested in how change impacts your supply chains or your ESG strategy, it's worth connecting with Achilles. Visit achilles.com to learn more.
Now, just to remind our listeners and to set the scene for our next guest, what are grey elephants and why do they matter? Well, grey elephants are forces of progress. They're big, visible forces reshaping society and business, and they carry massive impact, yet they're routinely underplayed or politely avoided, sometimes even ignored, until they start to stampede. Now, they're not black swans. They're hiding in plain sight. And we've seen this pattern before. COVID-19 was a grey elephant, a visible warning we knew about ahead of times, but it was ignored. These are known systemic vulnerabilities in our system. There's more than just pandemics. We've actually identified 7 of these grey elephants. And if you want to keep ahead of change, keep ahead of progress, see where it's coming from, you need to keep your eye on these grey elephants. Now, modern slavery sits in that same category. It's woven into the global economy. It's hiding in plain sight, in labor markets and supply chains, and it challenges the comforting story that progress is automatically humane. And that's why I'm genuinely excited to be speaking to James Cockayne, the Australian Anti-Slavery Commissioner, because tackling modern slavery isn't just about risk management, it's about reckoning with a hard side effects of progress and building an economy where prosperity and human dignity reinforce each other. James, Commissioner, it's wonderful to have you here on the Elephant in the Boardroom podcast.
Thanks, Dean.
To start off, tell our listeners a bit about yourself, your role, and why it's so important.
Thanks, Dean. It's great to be with you. My role, I should be clear from the beginning. I'm the Anti-Slavery Commissioner for a part of Australia called New South Wales, our largest jurisdiction economically and by population. There is actually also another Australian Anti-Slavery Commissioner, former Senator Chris Evans, who has responsibility for similar kind of mandate than I have, but he has it for the whole country. We're rather unusual in Australia in that we have these two separate regimes operating both at the federal level and then at the state level. And my role under state law involves a big focus in particular on public procurement. So working very closely with the state government, which is the largest employer in the Southern Hemisphere, to ensure that commercial activities by public authorities in New South Wales worth about $40 billion Australian, which is at the moment probably about, 20, 25, 27 billion US dollars, that activity is undertaken with appropriate safeguards in place to ensure we're not buying goods made with modern slavery and then taking appropriate remedial action where we are linked to those goods and services. I also have functions relating to direct support for victims, including running a hotline here in New South Wales, which receives about 4 calls a week from victims here in New South Wales alone that are looking for support and assistance. And we do a range of advocacy, promotion of good practice, awareness raising, and policy work as well. So it's important because, as you say, Dean, this is an issue that is hiding in plain sight. We know that there are these structural problems that allow vulnerable people to be exploited in a huge array of supply chains, both onshore here in Australia and offshore. But it's often unclear because of the highly disarticulated nature of those supply chains who exactly has which responsibilities for tackling this problem. And if they are going to do it, to what extent are buyers, for example, prepared to pay a price premium to ensure that they're actually getting legally made goods? At the moment, our system tends to reward companies and suppliers that can compete on cost. And if you can outsource the risk by moving it to another jurisdiction and pushing it down onto the most vulnerable workers who don't have the voice and aren't able to speak up and assert the true cost of the production of those goods and services, then you may well find that you're actually operating at an unfair competitive advantage in the market. So that's the kind of problem set that we're grappling with here.
Thanks, James. Thanks for that overview. I mean, it's such an incredibly important area and one that, I think there's very little knowledge and insights that people have. We know it's happening on the periphery, but it's great to know that there are people like yourself out there really kind of amplifying people's awareness on this. So why is modern slavery such a visible, high-impact grey elephant that many organizations still underweight until a trigger event forces action? Because I think that it is the elephant in the room, isn't it? They kind of know about it. They maybe don't know the extent of it, but they would rather ignore it. Hopefully it goes away or somebody else deals with it. It's not their problem. Why do they still underweight? It's such an important issue.
Yeah, look, I think it's a little bit like the way that business approached a number of other risk categories for a while until their feet were held to the fire by regulatory change. So I'm thinking, for example, of risks around bribery and corruption, or indeed around climate change. Those are risks that boards knew about for a long time. They took an interest in. Senior leaders in C-suites understood that there was the potential for risk exposure here, but often it took a particular event, like you said, to crystallize that risk and place it on the balance sheet in some way before a governance mechanism would really sit up and think about, okay, this is something we need to have risk management strategies in place for. Sometimes it was a legislative or a regulatory change that triggered that shift in mindset and that understanding of a need for a more preventive and structural approach. What we've seen around modern slavery and broader human rights due diligence in the last 15, 20 years is a growing effort by governments, particularly in Europe, the United States, here in Australia. But now we see that effort expanding through Asia and through other parts of the world. Efforts by government to really get boards proactively to think about this, but they've tended to date, these efforts, to focus on corporate reporting. So the challenge here is that that signals to the businesses that this is essentially a compliance challenge. And what we're now seeing really is a shift by government saying, okay, hang on, this hasn't worked the way we had hoped. We had hoped that by requiring disclosure of risk and risk management practices, it would create a race to the top because of the reputational costs. But the mechanisms aren't quite working. We're going to have to get more serious in our legislation about substantive requirements for an oversight of due diligence efforts by those businesses. And that's the kind of shift we've seen in the bribery and corruption space over time. It's the kind of shift we now see around climate and in particular carbon emissions. We're at that point now with modern slavery where we're just beginning to see that translation from a general awareness of the problem to actually beginning to be able to quantify the impact in terms of risk and value destruction and indeed value creation for firms as they differentiate themselves on these risk management practices.
Right, right. So you talk about value creation, and it sounds to me like it makes a lot of good business sense for the CEO and a board of a company to give some serious time and attention to modern slavery. So, James, if you were advising a CEO who wants to lead rather than react, what are the top things or top moves that you would say prioritize over the next 12 to 18 months to turn modern slavery action into an advantage? And not just another compliance cycle.
Well, what's particularly interesting about modern slavery as a risk management area is that it's dealing with a particular kind of risk, social risk. It's less about the risk to the business itself, and it's more about the risk that the business faced from disruption of relationships because there's risk crystallizing on people. It's people who are being subjected to modern slavery, and they're very vulnerable and often disempowered people. So it may be that they struggle to crystallize that risk back on the business. But if you ignore that, if you just let the grey elephant sit there in the room, the danger is that you wake up one morning and you're reading of stampede of grey elephants about your business in the newspapers or through a litigation. For example, actions in courts are beginning to be brought around both connections to forced labour and modern slavery itself, and misleading and deceptive conduct type claims because businesses are saying they're ethical, but actually they're connected to these kinds of practices. So leadership in this space is really about wrapping your arms around that risk as it relates to your business. And that means a couple of things. First of all, it means you need to do a risk scanning. You need to really understand where the salient risk for your business is in these terms. And that, again, that's not necessarily going to be where your biggest spend is or your biggest supply and purchasing by volume. It's about where the risk is greatest to people. Secondly, you're going to then need to build relationships with those at-risk stakeholders so that you can, over time, work with them to ensure that they're protected and you're still able to buy the widgets that are being manufactured and supplied to you, but in a way that doesn't rely implicitly on their forced labor or modern slavery. And again, that kind of stakeholder engagement with vulnerable populations is not something that we necessarily see all sectors having the capabilities for. Some sectors, extractives, for example, much longer history of managing community conflict and developing those kinds of relational capabilities. But in other sectors, tech, for example, new tech, we don't see those relationships as being well developed. So the strategic level in business really needs to be thinking about what this means. And the value creation opportunity comes not only from differentiation from other actors, and as regulators require business to do this, the ability, for example, to attract capital cost discounts through differentiation on ESG and good modern slavery practices. The other upside here comes from simply understanding your supply chain and being able to manage those relationships in a way that gives you resilience for a range of risks that might emerge. You mentioned the pandemic earlier, Dean. Well, that was a good example of how sudden, unexpected, or as you said, grey elephant stampedes can lead to disruption in supply chains. If you don't understand how your supply chain actually operates, you're flying blind as a board and as
Yeah.
a C-suite. You don't know where your risk exposure is. So the kinds of due diligence you have to do to understand modern slavery risk actually have all these collateral benefits of helping you trace and understand how your supply chain works and develop those relationships along the supply chain. They give you much more resilience and protect value creation for the long term.
Okay, so there's a lot more value that's on the periphery that sort of spills over, I guess, to looking at modern slavery that benefits the business in many different areas.
Yes, and I think, it's also important to understand that modern slavery risk isn't always necessarily at the far off, poorly regulated, informal economy end of your supply chain. It may be a lot closer to home than you anticipate. For example, here in New South Wales, when I started in this role 3 years ago, I think the general perception amongst business and government leaders was if we do have exposure to modern slavery risk, it's probably because of activities mining certain elements in Africa or other places there are many intermediaries between us and them. What people are now realizing is even in some of the smallest, shortest supply chains, for example, school cleaning arrangements here in New South Wales, there are very significant modern slavery risks because of the way that labour hire works here in New South Wales. So that risk is much more ubiquitous and often more central to the business model of businesses than we have perhaps understood to this point.
James, I'm curious because slavery was something I always imagined was something we had in our history books. And is modern slavery on the increase? Is it being actively managed and perhaps on the decline? Where do we sit with modern slavery?
Unfortunately, it appears to be on a very radical upward trend at the moment. So,
Really?
according to the best available estimates from the United Nations and the International Labour Organization, there was a 25% increase in the
Mm,
5 years between 2020 and 2025. So, there
right.
was a jump from about 40 million people in modern slavery globally to about 50 million people.
Wow.
And a lot of that has to do with increased vulnerability as a result of geopolitical tension, displacement due to state breakdown, or even climate change in certain cases. So, actually, I would say the outlook is quite bracing. That as we see a reorganization of the world order, there are real risks of disruption to supply chains as a result of geopolitical shifts. And that's going to create vulnerability for a lot of people and a lot of businesses that could lead to an increase in exploitation. But we also see interesting fault lines emerging in different economic and trading blocks around their approaches to these kinds of risks in their supply chains. Perhaps less obvious, those fault lines, than you might at first expect. The first movers on these issues were US, the UK, Australia, Western European countries. But there's now an array of Asian countries that are introducing mandatory human rights due diligence arrangements for their businesses. Thailand, Japan, Korea, Indonesia is now looking at this, all really on the front foot, saying if we're going to be part of these supply chains, we want to make sure that workers, including our workers, are appropriately protected, and that that's not only reliant on government enforcement, but also through business due diligence.
Okay, wow. So big numbers, 40, 50 million, but some good sort of green sort of shoots of activities that are happening to tackle this grey elephant.
Some positive things going.
Some positive things, right? But a lot more can be done.
Absolutely.
So let's move on from governance into what good looks like on the ground, because I think this is where reality often breaks through. So many modern slavery risks are amplified by standard supply chain practices, price, pressure, short lead times, late changes, labor brokers, subcontracting, things like this. So if a CEO changed just two or three supply chain or procurement practices this year, which would most reduce the exploitation risk? And also, at the same time, improving resilience and cost of service and, brand reputation, things like that.
Well, the short answer is, of course, it depends. It depends on your business and how it operates and how the supply chain works. But what's common to that is that you need to know the answer to that question. So if there's one thing I could get CEOs to do, it would be in cooperation with any board they might have and with their C-suite to really say, okay, we need to understand what the risks to the people connected to our business along the supply chain are, and how we're going to address those risks over time. And the short answer is very likely in most supply chains to be we can't address this on our own. Not just because there may be government actors that are involved at some point that need to enforce appropriate standards, but because simply an individual firm's market power may not be adequate to negotiate with suppliers to change their business practices. So there's a need really to work along supply chains, including with vulnerable populations and affected workers, to understand how that risk works and which of those business practices that you pointed to is actually the source of vulnerability to exploitation.
Yeah.
In the textile and fashion industries, for example, it's very much linked at present to the kind of fast fashion or super fast fashion trends that we see and the downward cost pressures and turnaround pressures that are put on subcontractors and piece workers and so on. So there needs to be efforts along a number of actors to work together to try and find ways to deliver the product they want to deliver, but in a way that isn't simply displacing all the risk down and down and down the supply chain onto the most vulnerable. In other industries, there might be significantly more vertical integration in the way that things are produced. And you find then that there is greater ability for lead buyers, for example, to influence the hiring and labor management practices down the supply chain. So it will depend on the particular business model and the strategic environment you're operating in. But the central question that every business should be asking itself and isn't necessarily yet is what is my risk exposure and what is my leverage to address that problem? Where else can I find leverage through working with partners, peers, even in some cases competitors to address this? And what we see is that competition regulators around the world increasingly are saying, actually, this kind of pre-competitive collaboration by firms to ensure that we don't have goods and services entering the market in the first place that are made illegally, that's totally okay. That is not anti-competitive, and we will put in place arrangements to ensure that people have the top cover they need in order to feel comfortable cooperating and indeed collaborating with peers in a way that doesn't otherwise breach competition law to allow those kinds of supply chain collaborations to emerge. I think that is a really great place for any business to start. Think about what your risk exposure in your key products and services is, and then look at what are the collaborative organizations emerging in that space to try and tackle these risks.
Where does this risk typically sit in a business? Who owns it? Who are the people that you tend to work with?
Well, the first question is, does anybody own it? I mean, that's a really
Yeah.
good question. And as you're doing your internal analysis and screening, that's a great place to start. Too often, this falls de facto to the procurement professionals. And that's frankly a little unfair. We can't solve everything through the procurement process itself. Even if we take an expanded understanding of the procurement process to include contract management, you know, that professional skill set is not necessarily built to have ongoing relationships with vulnerable populations offshore, for example. And then what we often see is that there's an event happens, there's a stampede of grey elephants, there's a pop-up in the media about our business being associated with this risk, and suddenly it becomes legal or even communications that get involved. A healthier approach would be to make sure that this is dealt with through the business-wide risk management frameworks that are in place, so that whether it's a risk and audit committee or a chief risk officer, someone like that is really taking ownership for understanding this risk more holistically, seeing how it touches on each of those business areas, and thinking about what the systemic change internally is that's needed to equip those actors to be able to do their bit in managing this risk for the long term, so that when that media story does pop up, you're able to say, yes, we're aware that this is an issue we have to manage in our supply chain. We have relationships with the relevant suppliers. We have the right contractual terms in place so that when this happens, we don't just run and leave the workers high and dry. We actually stay and engage with the suppliers and work with them to address the underlying issues. Those kinds of systems in place will protect value in your business, including from risks of reputational damage.
No, that's excellent. I think that's great advice for CEOs and business leaders. And, you know, somebody needs to own this risk and this challenge and turn it into an advantage. So, yeah, how should we treat companies that uncover problems, that do this audit, that understand their supply chain and then uncover problems versus, say, those who repeatedly don't find anything? What does good faith look like in practice, I guess?
So we should be rewarding good practice and punishing negligent or bad practice. We should be, and there's certainly some the direction of travel here in the market is encouraging. But again, I come back to the analogy to the way that market has learnt to factor in climate and environmental risks, and is now doing that, for example, around biodiversity issues. There needs to be clarity on the standards to which businesses are being held to account if the market is actually going to be able to factor this in a meaningful, reliable way at scale in a range of business decisions. That means there is a governance problem here. It's not something that any business can do on its own. Some businesses working together, particularly along supply chains, are sometimes able to establish standards in a way that can then be factored into business decisions. But in some cases, it may be that governments also need to back those standards. As we've seen in the environmental space, you do ultimately, if you have competing standards, you ultimately need a process of harmonization so that there's consistency and a level playing field across the market. Once we have that, and once we have the appropriate metrics, such as carbon emissions, scope 1, 2, 3, how those work, you can start to factor this at scale into a huge array of business decisions. We're not there yet with modern slavery, but the direction of travel is very encouraging. And businesses that are identifying this risk, reporting on it, engaging it, and trying to remediate it should be applauded and rewarded, whether it's in the public domain or indeed through institutional investment decisions, for example. We are beginning to see that, but there's some distance to go yet.
But I assume that there are some organizations that are turning ethical supply chains into genuine competitive advantage, in terms of trust, resilience, attraction of talent and even capital. Where do you see the most credible non-PR opportunities for businesses to create real economic value from modern slavery action for their stakeholders and for themselves?
I think ultimately, I would say it boils down to having a stewardship mentality that business leaders, business owners, business governors are really stewards of the value that the business itself is generating, and that is going to be delivered to not only the owners, but to the employees and to all of those who draw value from the business, including the communities with which it engages. That leads you very quickly to a more relational approach to the way the business operates and to thinking about how understanding and being intentional about those relationships creates resilience in your business model and value creation. So that may well not be a big PR opportunity. It's not, there's no downside to having positive relationships with your stakeholders necessarily, but it may not be in and of itself particularly big news for the market or for anybody watching along. But what it does is it immunizes the business against those stampedes of grey elephants, frankly. It creates the fencing in the corral that allows you to steer and manage those elephants when they get restless in a way that protects the business's value creation for the long term.
Yeah, so it's spot on. I mean, in our research, we see that when these grey elephants start to stampede, huge amounts of value can be destroyed. So it's very much about being prepared and then trying to shape the future in ways that prevents that stampede. And then not sitting back and going, if they do stampede, not sitting back and going, well, we didn't see this, because it's in their plain sight.
Yes, and I think but there's also the opportunity to think about this in terms of positive value creation and not just risk
Mm.
mitigation. So
Yeah.
elephants are pretty hard workers if you know how to persuade and look after them. So if you are understanding the way that your widgets are produced, the way that your clothes or whatever your product is produced, and forming relationships with those workers, those communities. Quite often, what you find is that leads to value creation opportunities, to product innovation, to process innovation in ways that you wouldn't have spotted if you weren't in that positive dialogue with those stakeholders.
Brilliant. James, if I may try and sort of summarize this really excellent conversation, and thank you for your answers, James. Huge insight and really valuable. So modern slavery and human trafficking, they're brutal. They're degrading crimes. They destroy lives. They violate universal human rights. And then also, the bottom line is for businesses, certainly, they drain billions from the global economy. But the good news is we do have strong international legal frameworks and collaboration mechanisms. But the real progress, I guess, depends on greater corporate responsibility and ownership in this space. Would you agree with that as a summary?
Yes, but I don't think the only reason to do that is because it's the right thing to do. I think it's also just plain smart, savvy, strategic business leadership, frankly. I think any business that's interested in creating and protecting value for the long term, it's quite obvious that you need to have good relationships with the stakeholders who can make or destroy that value.
Brilliant. James, thank you so much. Been both sobering and inspiring. If there's one message I'm taking away, it's that modern slavery action is ultimately about leadership. It's about ownership, it's about system design, and it's about making exploitation harder to hide, easier to detect, and inevitable to fix, I guess. So thanks very much for your time, James. And we look forward to hearing more about your great work and this ongoing big mission to end modern slavery. Thanks very much for your time and the work that you're leading. It's fantastic.
Thanks for having me, Dean. It's been a pleasure.
Next time on Elephants in the Boardroom.
When it comes to just all generations in general, one of the best things for increasing engagement, retention, I see is twofold. When someone feels they have ownership of what they do, and when someone feels accountable to a team. These two things ripple for every generation, but I feel that for Gen Z specifically, where the digital infrastructure of the world, i.e. you have these platforms, LinkedIn, Glassdoor, Indeed, you can move around in roles so much more easily. So people talk about that loyalty clash, which I know we probably won't get into right now, but it's a whole can of worms to open there.